Good morning. My name is Chanel Hayson. I am the Director of Outreach and Community Relations for the nonprofit, the Elakha Alliance, which I'll tell you about in a couple seconds. But welcome to our 2024 Elakha Alliance Virtual Science Symposium, previously known as the Sea Otters Science Symposium, but we focus on much more than just sea otters, so we changed our name this year. This is our sixth symposium event, so we're very happy to have you all joining us live with us today. And I've just got a quick little intro before we start our speakers. So the Elakha Alliance is a nonprofit based here in Oregon. We are committed to restoring sea otters on the Oregon coast where they once thrived and played a crucial role in maintaining the health of our marine ecosystems. And through collaborative efforts in research, education, and conservation, we aim to bring this keystone species back, helping to restore the balance in our coastal ecosystems, environments, and to protect Oregon's rich biodiversity. We were created by a Siletz tribal member, the late David Hatch, and the word Elakha is a native word for sea otter. And a quick little thing you can say to remember our name is Boom Shaka Elakha. Everybody remembers it that way. So a quick little symposium etiquette that we have. Everyone's attendees, your webcams and mics will be turned off for the symposium. So if you have any questions or comments, I have the chat open. If you want to jump in there and say where you're tuning in from today, that would be really great. And then we have the Q&A feature on, so you can type in your questions for the speakers and we will get to them at the end of their presentation. Remember to please be respectful to everyone in the chat box. We'll be sharing links relative to each presentation today. And thank you just so much for joining us. We're very excited to get this symposium started. So here's the quick schedule of the day. If you can't stay on for the whole amount of time, that's totally all right. You can tune in and tune on whenever you want to see a presentation, which is why we will keep to the strict schedule. But we'll have 3 presentations at 9, 10, and 11, and then we'll have a little break so you can go grab some food from 12 to 1. Then we'll jump back on at 1, 2, and 3 for our final presentations. The theme of this year's symposium is the Endangered Species Act at 50, Successful Species Reintroductions. This 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act is a major milestone in conservation history. And by attending the symposium today, it allows you to be part of this historic moment, celebrating progress while recognizing the work still needed to protect endangered species. So these incredible speakers today will showcase successful reintroduction efforts, offering valuable insights into the strategies, challenges, and innovations that have helped bring back endangered species from the brink of extinction. So now I am going to pass it over to my amazing colleague and the board president of the Elakha Alliance, Mr. Bob Bailey, who will be introducing our speakers today.
Thanks a lot, Chanel, and thanks everybody for being here. We're really excited to be doing this. I think is our 5th, or maybe perhaps it's our 6th Elakha symposium in the fall. So we're thrilled today to really be broadening the scope of our presentations from just sea otters to the Endangered Species Act in general. And I'm especially delighted to have Joe Roman as our leadoff speaker. Joe is a conservation biologist, marine ecologist, and author, currently at the Gund Institute for Environment at the University of Vermont. He's received his PhD from Harvard in 2003 in organismic and evolutionary biology, and has a master's degree in wildlife ecology and conservation from the University of Florida. But perhaps most wonderfully, he's a prolific writer, and his most recent book has the intriguing title of Eat, Poop, Die: How Animals Make Our World. And it's a great read. He's got a great narrative voice, and I commend that book to you. In 2012, he was awarded the Rachel Carson Environment Book Award for Listed: Dispatches from America's Endangered Species Act. and he's written extensively for New York Times, Science, the Audubon, New Scientist, and many other publications. So he's a great read, a great voice, and I'm looking forward to his presentation today. So Joe, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Bob, for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen. Chanel, how does that look?
Looks good.
Looks good, Bob? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. All right. Well, Bob, I thank you for that really nice introduction. You said that I had gotten my PhD in orgasmic and evolutionary biology, I believe, and I wish I did, or even orgasmic and revolutionary biology. So if you find that department has any openings, I'd be happy to apply.
I heard that mispronunciation.
You won't be the first, but it's a good intro. Anyway, so today I'm going to talk about really sort of hopefully set the stage for what I believe is an all-star lineup today, looking at recovery, reintroduction, and restoration. And since the framework is the ESA, perhaps we'll think about what things were like 50 years ago and how things have changed over the years. I know Tim will be talking later, and he did a lot of work with Jim Estes, who was one of my mentors, and the work that they all did was certainly influential to my entire career. So I appreciate that. So I can't, hold on one second. Pardon me, guys. There we go. On January 29th, 2019, a 37-foot whale stranded in the Everglades National Park. It was a baleen whale, not common. This is the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Mexico, so not common there. And it stranded on this beach and immediately caught the interest of scientists. A necropsy indicated that it was an adult male. It had no external signs of trauma. The interesting thing about it is that its DNA matched a migratory population of baleen whales. They were then known as Brutus whales in the Gulf of Mexico. I had been asked by the Natural Resource Defense Council a few years ago to do a review of species that were not that marine mammals that did not have the protections that they deserved. And I spoke to a government official off the record, and she said, if there's one animal that I lose sleep over, it's this Brutus whale in the Gulf of Mexico. They didn't, to that point, have a full-scale animal. And once they did, it gave them ability to look at everything from the morphology to the DNA to the cause of death. This is disturbing. They said there were no external signs of trauma. There was hemorrhaging, though, and acute gastric necrosis in the second stomach chamber. Whales, like cows, have multiple stomach chambers. This is about the size of a credit card. It's probably what killed the whale. Piece of plastic, internal. And, this is devastating news when you're doing conservation, because this is going to be very hard to fight. They feed at the bottom of the ocean around 200 meters down. And this is what has exposed it. The good news that came out of this tragic event is that there was now enough evidence to declare a new species. And it's the Gulf of Mexico, or Rice's whale. It remains one of the rarest whales on Earth. Population of maybe 30 to 50 individuals. About 25% of these whales died after Deepwater Horizon. Others were damaged had reproductive damage and respiratory illness. So Deepwater Horizon and other activities in that area endanger them, and the species was listed in 2019. For the most part, it's an American whale. It looks like it also exists off the coast of Mexico, but this one shows just how fragile a lot of species are. And it brings us to this realization that really was occurring back in the 1960s and 1970s, that we were allowing far too many species to disappear, and we had the ability to turn this around as long as we showed the desire. And this is the crime writer Raymond Chandler writes, all great crime stories are stories of redemption, and that's how I think of the ESA. These are black-footed ferrets here on the left. They were thought extinct for a number of years, then a few were found, then they were extinct in the wild, and now they've been reintroduced. It's still a challenge for them, but it's an incredible journey that these ferrets and the conservationists have had over the past couple of decades, in part sponsored by the Endangered Species Act. When we're looking at whales, that's what I'll be talking about most today, but not only. Historically, they comprised about 92% of marine mammal biomass. They were in all the oceans, and as we'll talk about, they migrate across those oceans. They were mostly known, this comes from National Geographic, by whaling initially, where their breeding grounds were, where their feeding grounds were. People were following them around the world. Starting at least 1,000 years ago commercially, and aboriginally, we could go back several millennia. This started to change, really. Populations started to decline drastically for all whale populations around 1900 with the development of diesel catcher boats and large industrial whaling boats where they could render the entire whale just in a very short time. And you can see here the number of whales that were captured, northern hemisphere on the top, southern hemisphere on the bottom. At some points, hundreds of thousands of whales were being killed every year, to the point where just about every large whale was endangered. That is, would have been humpback whales, blue whales, fin whales, sperm whales, all were at risk. Minke whales, the last ones to be hunted, the smallest ones, persisted. This is where we were really in the United States in the 1960s with the early development of endangered species protection. The initial laws didn't have much teeth. They protected endangered animals or threatened animals when it was practicable, was how it was written into the law. So sometimes they were protected, sometimes they weren't. They might be protected in national parks, but not on private land. And there were people around the time of the beginning of the Nixon White House thinking, is there any way where we can get these mostly voluntary laws or voluntary practices to come into law? That really started to shift in the early 1970s. I spoke with one of the biologists in Talbot in the Nixon White House in the early 1970s. And sperm whales, it was clear, were endangered. They had been hunted heavily for centuries, and in the 1960s were still harvested for lubricants. You can see here, this is a submarine. They were used in submarines. They were used by NASA for rockets. So the military and the Commerce Department, the Defense Department, Commerce Department said, look, we recognize that these whales are rare, but we need them. We need the oil. Talbot went to Dow Chemical and asked them if they could do an artificial lubricant that resembled sperm whale oil, and they said yes. He brought an affidavit to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the White House, and once they saw this affidavit that they could still get the lubricant they needed, they let go of those restrictions and allowed sperm whales to be protected, and they remain protected to this day. Now, when I spoke to him, Lee Talbot, he said he chose marine mammals and sperm whales in particular on purpose as the first species to be protected, because as he said, he didn't think there was going to be a lot of momentum for, let's say, the Freshwater Mussel Protection Act. As important as they are, he knew even then that save the whales, that these ideas were starting to emerge, and then whales could be the ambassador for this. So the Marine Mammal Protection Act was the first law that really was very strong law protecting wildlife in the United States in October 1972 that protects all marine mammals to this day. And that enabled the passage of the Endangered Species Act of the following year. It was signed by Nixon. There was no opposition in the Senate, including Bob Dole signed off on it and many conservative senators, and overwhelming support in the House. And that's the law now that a lot of things we're going to talk about today, both the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act, and I'm happy to answer questions about other laws that have been really protective. These are the ones that really started to change the way we approached managing animals, at least on a federal system in the United States. And it's working. You know, people often ask how you do your job as a conservation biologist. Isn't it depressing? Well, sometimes it is, but sometimes it is amazingly effective. And you all, many of you, I think, are probably on the West Coast right now and probably have seen gray whales multiple times. The gray whales were really, you know, highly endangered and could have gone extinct without these protections. It recovered in 1994, bounced back from about 11,000 to 27,000 in 2016 numbers still are in flux, but here's an example of where two laws had a big impact on the number of individuals and allowing the species to return to its important ecological function in those areas. Similarly, there were about fewer than 1,500 whales in the 1970s and the humpback whales in the 1970s. They increased amazingly by 6% per year. And the number is about 21,000. That's a 14-fold increase in 50 years. I mean, hats off to both the whales for their resilience, but also to the many managers that allowed this to happen. With gray whales and humpbacks, we'll hear a lot about reintroduction today and rewilding. For those, it was really taking the pressure off, right? It was stopping the direct killing, reducing some of the indirect killing, and watching these species return. Very satisfying and not true for all whale species. By far, North Atlantic right whale, for example, has been protected since the 1930s. There are only 350 of them on the planet. So this often works, but some species need more aid than just keeping your hands off. Sticking to the Pacific, really one of the most phenomenal success stories, I think. Northern elephant seals, there were only about 20 of them in 1900. This was thanks to treaties signed by the United States, Canada, and Mexico. There are more elephant seals in this picture than there probably were in the world about 100 years ago. There are now almost 180,000. So that's probably as many as there ever have been, and gives you an example of how we can successfully restore species. Again, largely through protection. We're talking about the larger marine mammals here, but also through reintroduction and rewilding. I grew up in New York City. I never saw a whale. In fact, I don't think I ever saw any marine mammals growing up. Now, humpback whales have returned to New York City. There's even whale watching in New York. And this is phenomenal. And this is thanks to Marine Mammal Protection Act, Endangered Species Protection Act, but also the Clean Water Act. The water, I can remember sludge and sewage in the waters when I was growing up. The waters are cleaner, and we're also protecting our fisheries more. So all four of those laws resulted in the return of these species, which now you can see almost regularly off New York City. About 2/3 of marine mammals are following this trend, and about 3/4 of great whales have increasing numbers. So that's what we call lifting baselines. Many of you might be aware of the term shifting baselines, which was introduced by Dan Pauly a couple of decades ago in the late 1990s. The idea is you set your baseline from when you're a child or when you start your career, if you're a conservationist. And for the most part, you watch things get smaller and fewer. And that's a trend we see in fisheries. But it doesn't have to go that way. Certainly in my case, humpback whales, lots of whale populations, seal populations, especially here on the East Coast, they've gone up. So we can lift to those baselines as well. We can restore these species, again, either through direct conservation or reintroductions or rewilding, all of which are important tools. As a result, one example of the economics that shift is whale watching wasn't even a thing really in the 1960s. It's now a more than $2 billion industry. People, and I'm sure everyone probably that's online has gone on a whale watch if you're not a whale researcher and seen these whales and seen the excitement that people bring to this. It's money, it is excitement, it's awe, it's allowing people to get there. It has transformed our relationship to marine mammals, but also to the oceans. But other things have changed too, and this is a picture from International Fund for Animal Welfare. I was teaching a class a few years ago, and we had gone in the morning to an oyster aquaculture farm, and we had gotten up really early. I was like, you guys can have the day off if you want. We stopped for lunch, and we noticed that there was a stranding vehicle across the way, and there were 4 Atlantic white-sided dolphins that had stranded in the marsh, and we followed them from the marsh out to the beach and the release. And I realized that there were several police there. There were a whole team from International Fund from Animal Welfare, as well as veterinarians, as well as visitors. And it's something we've ignored in a lot of ways. It's the economics of stewardship. A lot of us on this call might work in this, but remember, it's not just whale watching that is important for the economy. It's also all the effort and time that we spend on the water or on land trying to restore these systems. And I put together this slide a couple of years ago after I was on an oceans panel, where often most of the conversation was about the importance of fisheries, and that is important in this area. But in a lot of ways, I felt like stewardship and biodiversity had been overlooked. So a couple of colleagues and I, some students, calculated how much do people donate to marine stewardship in Massachusetts? How much time do they volunteer? And how does that compare to other more traditional extractive uses, such as commercial finfish and also shellfish? In Massachusetts, it's largely scallops. As you can see here, recreational fishing is dominant, not surprising perhaps, but it really is now. Recreational fishing is more valuable than commercial fishing in this area. Whale watching is about comparable to commercial finfish. By that, I mean cod or flounder or other species. The point to this isn't to diminish the importance of fisheries, but rather to acknowledge that almost without us noticing, we've shifted the way we approach the ocean and even the economics of the ocean. Many coastal economies have transformed from these wild capture fisheries to a diverse economy that includes whether it's stewardship or recreational fishing, whale watching, aquaculture. And the dream is that we bring these together. They all depend on healthy ecosystems. They all depend on abundant biodiversity. So can we acknowledge this and bring these groups together to help restore species? But it can be, that is not to be Pollyanna-ish about this, it can be challenging. These are gray seals on the left. When I was a kid, there were no gray seals off of Cape Cod. There are now tens of thousands. This is in part thanks to the Marine Mammal Protection Act. In Canada, gray seals are shot. In the United States, they're protected. Populations have expanded. And that's a cause for celebration, but also a cause for concern. It changed things. On the right there, great white shark is swimming offshore off of with gray seals between the shark and the sands there. And this puts people and gray seals in conflict because it's bringing sharks to there. And there have been, although very few, a couple of attacks there. So people think about the waters differently. And also gray seals can take fish off of fishers' lines. So here's something that I think most biologists, certainly not me, we were trained in a lot of ways to help rare species come back. But it's very rare that we've got a system where ocean predators are recovering and all of a sudden are becoming an important ecological and socioeconomic part of the oceans. And this can mean that conservation actions and human expectations can be out of sync. And that's a picture I took from Sitka there, save a shellfish, kill an otter, where there's conflict between otters and shellfish. And otters, we'll talk about it. This is really, what your guys have been talking about for a lot of years. And I'll talk about the success of restoration in a moment. But what we want to do, I think, as scientists is bring in as conservationists, bring in social scientists so you can mitigate this conflict early on and hopefully have everyone or many people celebrate these returns. One thing that's shifted in the past 20 years since I've been in this field is we've started celebrating recovery more. I can remember there was resistance to delisting the bald eagle from the Endangered Species Act or humpback whales because there was concern that the protections that they had for habitat, for example, would decline. But now I think it's acknowledged by many of us. Let's celebrate that recovery. Let's show that the Endangered Species Act is functioning and allow for downlisting and delisting species when it happens. We should also be anticipating what range expansion is going to be like and what the ecological roles are. One of the shark scientists in Massachusetts noted about a decade before white sharks returned, he said, well, you've got gray seals, you're going to get sharks eventually. It took about a decade for them to show up. So what kind of changes can we expect? And that's what really leads to we want to assess the true costs and benefits when relocating animals or if we're doing lethal removals. And this is really going to require trained science communicators, facilitators, and managers who can help resolve these conflicts. But the conflicts are still there. And one of them that I work on is Japanese whaling. And it's still to this day, it's been for a couple of decades now, whether it was scientific whaling or now it's acknowledged as commercial whaling. One of the arguments for killing whales is that they're serious competition with fisheries, so they're eating our fish, and also claims that the rise of small species like minke might be endangering larger endangered species like blue and fin whales. So these arguments are still being made. They were being made in the 1990s when I did some DNA analysis of whale meat in Tokyo with Scott Baker, Steve Palumbi, and colleagues. So this question has been around for a long time. So I had been working on looking at the Japanese push for whaling, and at the same time, I was taking a class in marine ecology and learned about this biological pump. The idea here is that photosynthesis only occurs at the surface where there's light, and through photosynthesis, phytoplankton take in carbon dioxide, and then that can be consumed by zooplankton, by krill, for example, or by copepods, and eventually by fish. And when they are moving up and down in the ocean, they're transporting that carbon to the deep sea. So that's the idea of a biological pump. You're getting carbons absorbed at the surface, and it's transported into the deep sea. And this is an enormous number. I was sitting in marine ecology at that point, and I had been working that summer on North Atlantic right whales and noticed that there was something missing in this drawing. So a couple of years ago, I actually uncovered my notes from that day when we were insulating our attic. And this is the drawing that I thought of when I was looking at that biological pump. I had been watching right whales that summer. They feed about 100 meters beneath the surface, often in mud, and they'll come back with mud on their bonnets, on their heads to breathe and to digest and to rest. And then often before they fluke or dive, they release an enormous fecal plume. And I can still remember that first large brick red fecal plume I saw in the water on the first day. And it occurred to me, if this feces is getting out there, maybe if there's nitrogen or other nutrients in it, it could be picked up by that phytoplankton or algae and then consumed by copepods, and then the right whales eat it. So originally I was getting this idea of some sort of a feedback loop. But even then I realized, well, right whales are pretty rare. So you can see on the left, what about when there were 10,000 whales? So if we're living in a rather depauperate ocean, what would things be like if there were a lot more whales in the water? This was not my thesis at that time. I was doing a master's. It wasn't my PhD. But eventually I met with a scientist who is willing, a biological oceanographer, Jim McCarthy, who is willing to consider this idea. One of the first colleagues I asked about this said, well, Joe, sure, I'm sure there's nitrogen in the whale feces at the surface, but is it ecologically important, or is it just a fart in a hurricane? So that's what Jim and I set out to answer. How much nitrogen is getting into the system? Is this whale pump important? If they're feeding at depth, they're releasing nutrients at the surface in contrast to the biological pump. Could those nutrients be picked up by phytoplankton, and how important could it be? So we built a model for the Gulf of Maine. I was at Harvard at that time. And what we found was that whales, the nitrogen that whales are providing to the system is more than all the rivers combined in the Gulf of Maine, and comparable to coastal point source, which is what humans put out in pipes closer to the shoreline, and smaller than atmospheric deposition. And a lot of nitrogen comes from pollution, from either industrial or agriculture. So in the present ocean, whales are important, though not as important as human activities. And that's true probably for many of the biogeochemical cycles. So we submitted this and it was rejected. The reviewer said, you guys are on the water there because we just built a model. Why haven't you collected any samples? Why haven't you looked at how much nitrogen is in the system, whether it's getting picked up the phytoplankton? It's the last thing you want to hear as a scientist, but we acknowledge they were right. So the next year, I started going out and collecting fecal samples. Popular Science picked up on it and called it one of the worst jobs in science. Getting out of the water is not bad. I will admit that right whale feces stinks really strong. You get it on your clothes, you can't wash it out. It's probably going to be, you'd have to throw the clothes away. But other depends really on what the animals are eating. The challenge, really, why it is a hard job, is it's really hard to find whale feces. You've got to basically, if you follow a whale enough, an animal long enough, it'll poop. But sometimes with the weather and timing, you just don't have enough time to wait for that defecation event. So colleagues of mine, Roz Rolland and Scott Krause, came up with an idea of how to optimize collecting whale feces. These is just to show you that the feces itself varies a lot. I think of it like Wilson Bentley, who is also known as Snowflake Bentley, lived just up the road from here in Vermont, said that every snowflake is different, is unique. I think of the same thing with whale feces, and you can see sperm whales there on the lower left, blue whales after they eat krill, another baleen whale on the upper right, and then a humpback whale calf poop there. So credible diversity, you get an idea when you're out on the waters why at least I can find this exciting. Again, though, it's hard to find. So Scott and Roz suggested that perhaps we could use a different tool, a different way, rather than just watching the water to find feces. So they used scat detecting dogs on the Bay of Fundy in the early 2000s. This dog here is Fargo on the left. He was a companion animal for an elderly woman. When she went into assisted living, he started working as a sniffer dog in prisons in Washington State. And then he got what I think would be a dream job for many dogs. He became a wildlife detective dog, a wildlife scat detecting dog, looking for everything from grizzly scats to mountain lion scats to fisher scats. And eventually, Scott and Roz brought him on to their boat off the coast of Maine and New Brunswick. So I'll show you what this pattern looks like. That's a North Atlantic right whale. The only problem for Fargo was that he was susceptible to seasickness, so he would take Dramamine every time he went out. Roz was a vet, so she could deliver that. Bob, the other dog that was trained to do this, was terrified of whales, so he would hide at the bottom of the boat when a whale emerged. So Bob ended up retiring in Vermont after a season. This is what it looks like on the right here, a scent cone. Any of you have ever watched a dog following a scent? You'll often see him sallying upwind. So this is Fargo in that black square on the right. He detects it. He's excited. His tail is wagging. When you see the X, he's out of the scent cone. So he's relaxed. He doesn't smell it. And then the boat driver is going upwind, going against the prevailing wind direction. And when you see that circle, it's about 100 meters from the fecal sample. And then that's where humans can smell it. And then Fargo got it. He could increase the number of samples that were collected in a day by about 2.5 times, which is substantial because, as I said, there were some days we wouldn't find any. So Fargo helped enhance the ability of us to find these samples. What we have done that's changed now is that dog technology is fantastic. It's still being used for killer whales in the Pacific Northwest, but now we have some other ways to get an idea, to understand what whales are doing beneath the surface, and that's using suction cup tags. The tags go on the back of the whale, and then you get an idea of where the whales are feeding, how far they're diving, how they're moving, how they're interacting with other whales. Things that we could only dream about when I started in this field in the 1990s. So we've got these suction cup tags. They're kind of hard to get them on. So now there's new ideas to use drones to drop these tags. So this is in Gulf of California. Let's watch this. So that's the drone there. The tag is on the back. Fin whale S is exhaling. And right there, you see the whale doesn't even flinch. And that's going to allow scientists to follow these whales for a few hours and up to a day. Now we get some ideas of really what's going on beneath the surface, whereas almost everything we understood about whales were really probably the most boring part of their lives. I'm going to show you a film. I think it's what I have queued up next for what it looks like when you have a camera on one of those. This really blew my mind the first time I saw this. Oops. Here we go. So this is a shot on a humpback whale calf off the coast of Maui. Were collected by Lars Bader and his colleagues at the University of Hawaii. And there's pee, and I never get to see. So it's a calf on the right. Mom is up top. Mom is peeing there. These are mackerel scad that are feeding on the sloughing skin. And now the cat, and a friend of mine wrote some music for this. I'm not sure if you can hear. And you can see here on the right, milk. So the calf is feeding right now. So we're getting an idea really of what it's like to be a humpback calf. And it helps that we're in the clear waters of Hawaii. And we'll talk about what this means ecologically, just like I was talking about that whale plankton, other processes in play. I'll give you a minute just to watch this. That's mom's pectoral fin on the left there. Calf is feeding again, nursing. That's the grooves, the rorqual grooves of the mom up top. Calves can't hold their breath as long as adults can. So now the calf is going to the surface. And it's at the surface. That's Maui in the background. And one more surfacing, a breath, and you'll see the researchers on the left, and there's mom in the lower left. The researchers will be coming in. There you go. You see the research boat there. Well, there we go. So a long segue there to those original reviewers who said, get out on the water and start measuring it. And what we did find, as we had hoped, is that there was high ammonium or nitrogen concentration. Why does that matter? In the summer, in this area and in many parts of the Northern Hemisphere, it's nitrogen that's the limiting factor. So they are providing what is essentially a nitrogen fertilizer to the surface from deeper waters. And there also, we have found that ammonium, when it's in or that the fecal samples, when they're mixed with just regular water, background water, it enhances the growth rate, the primary productivity increases of phytoplankton. So yes, indeed, it looks like they, on a small level, it can increase growth of phytoplankton, and at a large level, it can have a big impact on areas where whales are feeding. So the more whales are feeding, the more nitrogen and the higher the productivity. I just showed you that picture from Hawaii. It's not just this pump that's happening. When we have abundant animals, these ecological functions that are emerging also can move nutrients, vital nutrients, from high latitudes to low latitudes. Humpback whales feed off the coast of Alaska in the North Pacific, and many of them breed in Hawaii. I just showed you that image. And in those areas are low nutrient, clear waters. In this case, it's not poop really, since the whales aren't feeding that much. It's pee. It's the nitrogen in the pee that's coming through, and also feces from the calf. And it can be placentas. And when whales die, that's a tiger shark on the right-hand side with a dead calf off the coast of Western Australia. Interestingly, in areas where humpbacks feed, you often find nurseries for sharks. The sharks aren't likely to attack directly, but they're feeding on carcasses when there's high infant mortality in those areas. These are 4 ecological pathways that we've been chatting about for whales, thinking about them, the moving of nutrients. They also can have effect as prey, especially when killer whales feed on them. And we've spoken a lot about poop, but we haven't chatted that much about carcasses. They can also bring, of course, blue whales, for example, are the largest animals ever to have existed on the planet. So you can imagine how much subsidy of food can come when an animal strands, when it dies. And this was a study done by Kirsten Leiger a few years ago, looking at how stranded whales can have an influence on polar bear populations, especially in low ice seasons, because they can provide large nutrient subsidy, as you can see in this picture, when ice is relatively rare. Also bring enormous amounts of food and resources to the deep sea. These are called whale falls. Amazingly, more than 100 species are only described from whale falls, and I'm showing you one on the top there, which is Osidax, or bone eater. Even though it's called bone eater, it doesn't have a mouth, doesn't have a gut, it doesn't have an anus. It's using chemosymbiotic bacteria within its gut. So it's bringing nutrients into what's called a trophosome, and those nutrients are being picked up and providing food for the worms. And that's just one of the many amazing species that survive in the deep sea here. I worked on a very basic, I did some of this work when I was in Iceland on a Fulbright, and discussed some of these processes, and got up early to write the talk like I did this morning. And it occurred to me that pretty much what could define the work that I do is eat, poop, die, or how animals make our world. And the day I presented that, I'd said, someday I'm going to write a book about it. I threw in this German version because that came out today. I got an email this morning from the editors. So this has been a framing. I've been talking a lot about whales, but that this certainly is true for lots of species. And I'll mention sea otters in a moment, or salmon in the Pacific Northwest, and hundreds, probably most species have some impact on the nutrient ecology and on building ecosystems. Beavers might be the easiest to observe, but many other species have big impacts as well. They also can have an impact on the carbon cycle. This has been in the news lately. I will tell you that I am a bit skeptical of the large numbers that have been claimed for the carbon sequestration value of whales, but there is one way, or two at least, that we're confident about. One is when they die, carbon can be sequestered in the deep sea if they die in waters that are, say, more deeper than 1,000 meters. And two is they're storing carbon in their biomass. Again, we don't have large trees in the ocean, but we have large animals. And this is part of a shift to what our ideas are ecosystem-based solutions, whether it's focusing on seagrasses or mangroves or macroalgae, trophic cascade carbon, which is relative to sea otters, that idea that when you take otters out of the system, urchin barrens result and you have fewer kelp, and that means a release of carbon, and more kelp forests might help store carbon in the short term and the long term. These are some of the processes, if we restore ecosystems in the ocean, that might be enhanced. I want to be clear, though, that I've been talking about success stories. We have a long way to go here. This study, when it came out by Barron et al. A few years ago, I really couldn't believe it at first. So on the left list, we've been talking about mammals. 60% of all the biomass of animals on the planet are cows, swine, and other livestock. We humans make up more than a third. And all the wild mammals, that includes sea otters, that includes blue whales, that includes fin whales, white-tailed deer, only 4%. This is really the challenge we have, is how do we make what wild mammals matter again, right? How are we going to restore them? And that's the work that the people that are coming on today are going to talk about, whether it's mammals or whether are other wild animals. How do we get there? I think one of the best examples is the one that started this group, the northern sea otter. They didn't call it rewilding then, but it really is one of the most amazing examples of rewilding. And to get to some eating, sea otters eat about 25% of their body weight per day. Whales eat maybe 2 or 3%. My dog in the back there eats about 2.5%. So they eat a lot and they have a large impact. I'm going to just skim over this because you guys are all the experts on this. But this case of rewilding is amazing. Sea otters, and some of this work comes from Tim Tinker. I'm not sure if he's on yet. In the 1950s and 60s, sea otters were largely reduced to a remote island in the Aleutians, Amchitka Island. And at that time, the Atomic Energy Commission was planning to do the largest underground explosion in Amchitka. And some biologists from Alaska proposed, there were several thousand sea otters there, and Jim Estes was working there at the time. They said, look, we've been wanting to move sea otters back to an area on the Maine coast where they were extinct, but we don't have the money. This was before Alaska had any oil. So they proposed to the AEC, if you allow us to capture these, we will move them. So it'll help. You won't see as many dead otters, but you also might help restore this species throughout much of the Pacific Northwest and Southeast Alaska. And again, I think this comes from Tim's work. About 50,000 descendants of sea otters are from that evacuation. A couple of 1,000 were moved there. So it's 1 out of 3 in the entire North Pacific Ocean. Incredible success, and had a big ecosystem impact. I noticed the backgrounds that Bob and Chanel had of the kelp. When in the absence of otters, kelp forests are pretty small, and you have numerous urchins. When sea otters return, you're getting far more kelp forests, and it's having a widespread impact. Again, this is the idea that eating can also have an impact on these systems. So rewilding, I think, is something we can look at towards the future, whether it's as a climate solution to help reduce carbon in the atmosphere. I think that'll be relatively small, or more importantly, to enhance resilience, to help restore biodiversity, to help build beaches and other systems by having wild animals. And the great thing about rewilding is you release the animals, and if it's successful, they'll take care of themselves, as we've seen with sea otters. You don't have to keep adding and manipulating. with that, I'll just give a shout out. Let's try and replace our carbon footprint with the tracks of wild animals, and happy to take questions or thoughts. Thank you.
That was awesome. Thanks, Joe,
Thank
for
you.
kicking that off. I am almost done with Eat, Poop, Die. I do have it
Mhm.
right here, and it is truly a fascinating book. And I knew some of the things that you already presented on through the book, but I highly encourage people to read it because there's a lot of mind-blowing facts in there. Okay, we do have a couple questions, so I'll jump right on those. How do current whale populations, like 21,000 North Pacific humpbacks, compare to pre-hunting historic populations?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that we work on all the time, because whenever we're looking at present populations and the idea of how much nutrients they're moving, we want to get an idea of what the baseline was. In many cases in the southern hemisphere, populations are a lot smaller than they were historically. They were reduced to maybe 1 to 5% of those numbers, close to the edge. In the case of humpback whales, it's controversial, but I think we say probably double. And I actually have the number in a manuscript that we're working on. But the range is, we might be off by, let's say, 30% either way, because we really have struggled with that. Different ways that we get at those numbers are through logbooks, through DNA, which I've worked on. So there are different ways to get at it. The good news is we're getting better estimates all the time. The bad news is that's one hard to get to exactly. But I think in almost every case I can think of, populations were larger in the past, except for a few like Western Australia, where they may have rebounded completely. All of that having been said, climate change is changing things too. So even though we might have stopped killing them directly, changes in their food and the migration patterns can put them at risk again.
Stephen wonders, what were the small fish in the whale cam video with the calf feeding?
Yeah, it's mackerel scad. And I think we've been chatting. We should probably do like a short paper on that, because we really haven't had any observations, at least for this species, which was clearly feeding on the skin. We observed that directly, and probably also taking advantage of some of the leaking milk. So that's the species. That's common there, but I bet you that I know they're not the only ones. There's been records from Brazil and from Western Australia of other species also feeding on the skin.
Angela made a comment, if you know what the suction cups that were used to drop on the whale from the drone, that was amazing footage, by the way. What they're made out of, is it possible that could be biodegradable, or is it just plastic to?
It's silicone. They're the actual the suction cup. The good news is they're really expensive, so biologists never want to lose those. I have been on a large ship and spent 13 valuable hours looking for that. So it is not in any, if we can possibly help it, that is not contributing to plastic getting in the ocean. It's just too valuable. Of course, we wouldn't want to do it anyway. But that's the good news. There are, of course, some expensive electronics in there. It happens. We lose them sometimes, but it's rare.
Bob, I see you have a question. Do you want to ask directly?
Yeah, and this is a longer conversation because we're running out of time. But in our case, sea otters are managed through two key federal laws. The first is the Endangered Species Act, and then secondly is the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And I guess the question is, how can the delisting under the ESA, which the northern population of sea otters is no longer listed, how can that be reconciled with the more absolutist requirements and protections of the Marine Mammal Protection Act?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, because, of course, I wish the ESA was written in a different way. ESA is just, you get them recovered, which means they're no longer a threat, and you're good and they're out, they're off. And whereas Marine Mammal Protection Act, it has written in it ecological function. We are restoring these to their historic roles that they had. So the missions of those two laws are quite different. For conservationists, it's the same, right? And, to be frank, that's the advantage. We'll be talking about wolves later of that I study mostly marine mammals, because I know there's always another law that has these animals back, even if they're delisted. Where other species, once they're delisted, they don't have a marine, they might be open to overharvest or subsequent to other intense pressures. I've spent some time in Alaska, so I've heard both sides of view about sea otters and population sizes. From my, without weighing in on that particular decision, I think if we can get the otters back to where they're playing their historic role, that's really, that's a very far way down the line. And again, the group here knows much more about sea otters than I do. That's not my direct area. But those two laws definitely come into conversation often.
All right, we have 2 minutes. I have a couple more questions and we can get through them. Stephen asked, do female whales extrude their milk rather than allow calves to suckle?
Yeah, they're releasing it. That's right. I don't know if they're suckling. It's a good, so this is a question I don't know, but I believe so. So good. Thank you. I'm going to have to get back to you that, Stephen. They're certainly releasing it there, but I don't know if they're extruding it when the calf isn't suckling. Good question. Stump me. Thank you.
Okay, Sammy has a question on the topic of concern. Some have over the competition of whales and fisheries. Do we have pretty good understanding of the fish species that whales are feeding on and the extent to which they actually compete with us for fish? I know some seals have been historically persecuted based on false ideas about what fish they feed on.
Absolutely. There have been several studies, either from the guts of whales or modeling. The one that comes to mind, I mentioned Dan Pauly and his postdoc at that time, Lynn, had worked on, did a model and showed that at least in the systems around the Caribbean, there is very little conflict. And this was not taking into account the nitrogen cycling. In some cases, there is, whales will eat what humans eat. I think of Alaska, where the whales are feeding on salmon smolt in areas where the smolt are released. So it's very context dependent. But for the most case, there is not direct competition, at least historically what we ate. But there's been an increase, for example, in krill fisheries. So then we are coming into conflict with whales if we're going to start harvesting their krill, especially in the southern hemisphere. So there's a variation, but our knowledge for many species is pretty good about what they eat and where they eat it.
Awesome. Well, it's 10:01, so we've got to jump off and jump on our next speaker. But thank you very much, Joe, for joining us today and being our keynote. If you want to stay in touch with Joe, if you have any more questions, I can put his email, if that's okay with you, in the chat. And then we'll switch off to our next speaker. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the invite.
All right. Let's see. Katie, are you on?
I am here.
Hey. All right, super. Well, I will pass it off to Bob to introduce you.
Thanks.
Great. Good morning. Our next speaker is Katie Sewell. She's the lead abalone biologist and diving safety officer for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Her collaborative team aims to restore Washington's beautiful and endangered pinto abalone populations. Originally from Southern California, Katie now resides in Seattle, in which she's not diving to restore these marine snails. She enjoys playing water polo, underwater hockey, and exploring the outdoors on her e-bike. And I'll bet that if there were a way to get that e-bike underwater, she'd want to do that too. So Katie, we're pleased to have you here today. Abalone are a really important part of the sea otter story, and I'm anxious to learn what's going on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys. I just had my monitor turn off. Let me see if I can turn it back on. 1 second, please. Bear with me.
No worries.
Let's see here. Sorry, guys.
Well, fun fact is Katie and I went to Cal State University, Monterey Bay together. So this is our first reunion post being
It is.
Otter alum.
All right, let me share my screen.
Go for it.
All right, are you guys seeing that?
Yep.
Great.
Yes, yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. This is really exciting to be here. Yes, as Chanel said, I went to CSU Monterey Bay, and so our mascot was an otter. So I feel very close to otters, and I'm really excited to be here with the Elakha Alliance. So thank you so much for having me. Today, I will be talking about pinto abalone restoration in Washington State. I have been working here for the past 5 years. And before that, I was at Bodega Marine Lab, working on red abalone and white abalone there, and also green abalone a little bit. And then before that, I was at CSU Monterey Bay. And I just have to shout out, I am from Anaheim. I saw one person in the chat from Anaheim as well. So that's exciting. So let's get started. I'm going to tell this story in 2 acts. The first act will be an introduction to abalone in case anyone is not familiar with them. And maybe if you are familiar with them, it'll be a chance to learn a little bit more about them. So abalone are mollusks. They're one of the most, which are one of the most diverse groups in the animal kingdom. Nearly 10,000 described species. They're also gastropods. They belong to the Haliotis family, which so Haliotis is sea, otos is ear. A lot of different cultures will refer to them as like donkey ear shells or something of that nature. There's over 56 species of abalone across the globe, and even more subspecies. So we think over 100 subspecies. There's also observed examples of hybridization amongst abalone. So different species can hybridize with each other, although it's really rare. Their West Coast USA from Alaska to Baja is home to 7 of these species. And we'll learn a little bit more about that coming up. And they're very long lived. They can live a long time. They have pinto abalone specifically have lived to about 30 years in captivity, and red abalone, which is a species further down the coastline, can live to about 50 years. And abalone are just like us. They have, well, for the most part, a little different. They have a very famously iridescent shell. You might see them, might be familiar with them in jewelries. And popular use for them is guitar inlays. So you might recognize them from that. They have eyes. A lot of people don't realize, but they have eyes. They have 2 little eye stalks, and then they have a mouth, which we'll learn more about later as well. They have cephalic tentacles, which is for feeling out their food. The 2 kind of long, cute ones in the front, and then they have epipodia around that you can see around the shell down here. Chanel, can you guys see my mouse if I move it around?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. And then they also use this muscular foot to crawl around and attach themselves to substrates. So this is a juvenile abalone here. And then the adult version looks like this. So here's the mouth right here with the eyes and the tentacles. Their mouth is made up of something called a radula, which is made of thousands of calcified teeth. Here's an electron microscope photo of what those look like. So you can see the detail in those teeth. And they use that to scrape off algae and kelps, and they sort of clean the environment that they're in. So we know them, their nickname is the Roombas of the sea. So they're super important to kelp forest ecosystems, because when, you know, kelp and detritus fall to the floor, fall to the seafloor, these guys are the ones that are cleaning it up, making room for new critters, for new algae to settle, instead of just these kind of anoxic areas where things just sort of start just deteriorating without any control. So we call them the Roombas of the sea, and that's the part they play in kelp ecosystems. But as we'll learn, they're also sort of part of the food chain of the kelp ecosystem as well. So this is a little guy munching on some macrocystis, some giant kelp here. And they can have a ton of different sort of designs to their shell, which is something I love about them. And we're not exactly sure what causes such beautiful variations. You know, with shellfish, a lot of times the kelp that they eat can cause some variations. But if you can see down here, just this beautiful like chevron marking, or these stripes that certain ones have, these stripes all along the shell, or the beautiful green or beautiful, you know, red thread-like structures to the shell, is sort of what makes them celebrities amongst the shellfish world. An interesting thing too about their shells is they're really, really strong. So they are made of sort of like circular discs that are on top of each other. And that's actually being studied by some people for like armory and aerospace engineering. They don't crack very much. You know, you would have to put a lot of pressure on them to break the shell. So that's something that they have going for them. You'll also see that they have respiratory pores here, and that differentiates them from animals like limpets. And the theory behind these respiratory pores is when a predator is coming to, you know, try to sort of get these abalone or attack these abalone, they can suction down onto the rock, and these pores allow them to continue circling water through their gills. So it's just a great way to get some water movement through the gills. It's also a release area for their sperm and eggs, which we'll also hear more about later. Abalone also are interesting because while it is rare, they can also form pearls. So if a like a clam, if a boring clam tries to get in their shell, they calcify over, the nacre calcifies over the damage. And sometimes if they get enough damage, or you know, damage, or if they get a lot of sand inside of their gills, that can also sort of just under pressure, sort of like a diamond, just create these beautiful pearls. And this pearl is in the shape of its guts, basically. It's a conical gut structure, and so that just gets hardened over time. And so if anyone's ever seen an abalone pearl, you just know that it's just a special thing to see, and it's very unique to them. And of course, as some people may know, they're really tasty. And so this is me and my friend. Actually, I participated in the red abalone fishery in Northern California while I was working on fishery management. And before it closed down in 2017, red abalone are the largest abalone in the world. So that was one of the last fisheries that was open for abalone, was the red abalone in Northern California, which I would love to hear in the chat if you guys participated in. Those can get to, this was one of the record abalone at 14 pounds. So those guys get pretty big. Pinto abalone are a little smaller, and we'll hear about that more later as well. They're delicacies. They're pretty delicious, although they're a little tough. And they're also just harvested around the world. So this is the famous active fishery in Australia where the scuba divers actually use a shark cage